So now we have to suppose that at the end of year 2, policymakers can no longer allow the debt in period 3 to exceed GDP. So, in other words, the government cannot allow debt in period 3 to exceed GDP. In other words, the real debt to GDP ratio in period 3 can maximum be equal to 1. If the ratio is greater than 1, well, then debt in period 3 will be greater than GDP in period 3, and that is not possible. So, first of all, we have to find out what is the maximum value of the primary deficit in year 3 that the government is allowed to have. So we write up the debt, the real debt to GDP ratio in period 3. So we have 1 plus the real interest rate, that is the inflation, that is the nominal interest rate minus inflation, and we subtract the output growth rate, the growth rate of output, times the real debt to GDP ratio in period 2, plus the primary deficit relative to GDP in period 3. So from earlier, we know that the real debt to GDP ratio in period 2 is equal to 1.38. We know that B3 over Y3 should be equal to 1 because the debt relative to the debt can no longer exceed output. So this ratio can maximum be equal to 1. So if we calculate this, we have 1 is equal to 1 plus 2 minus 6. What is that? That is 0.96 times 1.038 plus the primary deficit in period 3 relative to GDP. So if we rearrange this term here, we get that the primary deficit relative to output in period 3 should be equal to 1 minus 0.96 times 1.38. And that is 0.00352. So in other words, the maximum value of the primary deficit is equal to 0.352% of real GDP in year 3. So, I mean, this is almost equal to 0. So one could almost say that the government is running a balanced budget. That is where taxes are equal to government spending. So if the government no longer can allow debt in period 3 to exceed GDP, the maximum value of the primary deficit relative to period 3's output is equal to 0.35%. That is the highest share of GDP that is the highest possible share of that is the highest possible value that the primary deficit of GDP can take. So the primary deficit relative to GDP cannot exceed 0.35%. What we have to do now is that we have to find the value of the primary deficit in any period t that is greater than t is equal to 3. So it says what value of the primary deficit will be required afterwards to maintain the debt to GDP ratio of year 3. So now we have to assume that we are in period 4 or 5 or 6, and we have to find that primary deficit that is required in order to maintain the constant debt to GDP ratio of year 3. And the debt to GDP ratio of year 3 is equal to 1. So what primary deficit is required to maintain this debt to GDP ratio? Well, we write up the real debt to GDP ratio in period T. Can be any T, can be any period, as long as T is greater than, again, 3, over YT, that should be equal to 1 plus R minus G times BT minus 1 over YT minus 1 plus government spending in period T minus taxes in period T over output in period T. So assume that we are in a period 4. If we are in period 4, then this here will be the real debt to GDP ratio in period 3. And we know that this one is equal to 1. And we know that we need to maintain the same real debt to GDP ratio in all periods after period 3. So this one should be equal to 1. So in order to find the primary deficit that is required to maintain the debt to GDP ratio of year 3, where debt can no longer exceed GDP, we rewrite our equation. We write that 1 should be equal to 0.96 times 1 plus this GT, which is the primary deficit in some future periods from the perspective of period 3. And we get that the primary deficit relative to GDP in period T is equal to 0.04, which is equal to 4%. So if the primary deficit is equal to 4% in all periods afterwards, we will maintain the debt to GDP ratio that was implemented in year 3. That is the ratio in which the government did not allow debt to exceed GDP.